right, man. Well, thanks for coming on the show today. We're just a few days away from the election, and I kind of, you're someone of a lot of different opinions, a lot of interests, and this episode will, I guess, air after the election. But being a guy from Georgia, I got a message the other day about so I didn't vote, and I got a message from someone who is also from Georgia, and was saying that like it was irresponsible of me in a way to not vote because I'm not thinking about the plight of minorities, etc. in Georgia. As someone who grew up there, and now your wife is Pakistani, so you have some, I think, insight into, maybe non-white communities. But what's your take on the election? How people are reacting to it right now?
Well, since we are jumping right in, let's pour some coffee. Yeah. We're going to need it for this.
All right.
Bismillah.
And I hear you're a coffee connoisseur, but this is just like Aldi coffee, right?
This is just Aldi coffee. So, yeah, apologies in advance. I hope it's okay.
Apparently, the secret is in the grind.
Yeah, we don't have a good grinder either, so
really?
It's just we're going to have to take what we get. I'm going to clarify for the viewers.
It does taste like
my coffee.
It does taste like the kind of coffee you would drink at like Folgers at a steel mill. Would you say?
Yeah.
What's your take?
On
a scale of 1 to 10.
At least it's not bitter.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just started putting the honey in my coffee. I don't know if you ever tried that.
No, I always drink it black. And sorry, I didn't even bring out any sugar.
That's fine. No, I don't do sugar. I'm normally a cream only guy. But I bought some. There's a guy out, guy at Darrell Costum in the West Burbs. He has a family farm in Wisconsin, I want to say. Mm-hmm. So he was selling some raw honey, and I was like, I heard that's good for allergies, and I got bad allergies, so I ended up buying some for him. And he just harvested in July, so I was like, I haven't really been using it. I'm not much of a tea guy. I'm a coffee guy.
Yeah.
So I just tried my coffee the other day. It was all right. I just trying to get that honey in the system somehow.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
but anyways, as the election's coming up here, I think you have an interesting perspective, and I kind of wanted to like just get your take on how people are reacting. It's almost for me, it seems like every 4 years, it's like almost like a apocalyptic approach people have. Mm-hmm. Like if we don't get our guy in, it's gonna be the end of the world.
Yeah.
So just want to get your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, going back to the story that you led with. I think the nature of a democratic election is that you get to vote who you want to vote for, and you get to not vote if you don't want to vote. And not voting can be as much of a statement as voting can be. I mean, voter turnout tells the public and the government about the consent of the governed. So not that we get to dissent from being governed, but it says something if you don't vote. That too is registering your voice on some level. So, I don't necessarily think that it's irresponsible not to vote. I think you should be free to do as you please. That's kind of the point, right? It's supposed to be a free, open society.
And just to be clear, I did vote. I just let the presidential part blank.
Yeah.
So I voted for everything else.
Well, it's a tough choice this year.
So I want to be frank. I feel like we were talking offline. I think that on this podcast, I've had a Democrat about a year ago. Mustafa Tamiz, he's a Democratic Party strategist down in Texas. Mm-hmm. Smart guy, been on Fox News. And I had a guy named Steve Kuckler, who's the chairman of the Republican Party in Delaware County, just outside of central Ohio being a swing state. Kind of got both their takes on things. For me, I'm not someone who's really been bothered with the rhetoric of Donald Trump. Like what he says on Twitter or things like that, it doesn't really bug me. But I will say that I felt like he handled the pandemic poorly, okay? I think if he had handled a pandemic in a way that I just felt like, and at the end of the day, I realized that he can't control a lot of things because states do what states are going to do. Mm-hmm. I think we're in Illinois, and maybe how the governor handled things in Illinois kind of kept things that kind of kept things under control a little bit. But my take on it was that at the end of the day was for me, because I thought I probably was going to vote for Trump. Mm-hmm. As blasphemous as that may be as a Muslim, Doesn't he hate us kind of thing? But so I, and then what I did was on the ballot, I was like, maybe I'll write in somebody. So I thought about writing in the prophet, peace be upon him, because I remember Yusuf Estes had talked about that back in 2004 when he came to our MSA at Ohio State, and he said that like maybe if that would be a statement vote, because I remember at the time in 2004 it was similar, the kind of rhetoric that like we got to get the vote out because if Bush was in the middle of the Iraq War and all that, but no one was really excited about John Kerry.
No.
Although I felt like today that comparing John Kerry had more, I guess, juice behind him than I would say Joe Biden.
Yeah, although it does feel like a similar election. Like you have a Republican incumbent and a Democratic candidate that people just are not that excited about. I think, Joe Biden is, he's a strange pick in the first place. I have stronger opinions about him than that. But just in terms of like the vibe that I'm getting this election, it feels very similar to what was that, 2004? It was 2004 that Kerry ran.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, this party guy who, will sort of do the basic Democrat thing were he to get into office. But there's just a noticeable amount of excitement on the other side. Like Bush had a base that really supported him. Trump has a base that really, really supports him. The Democrats are just sort of voting for, I mean, you think about like the Bernie base that has now been sort of like assimilated into the larger DNC tent. I saw this meme the other day online. The Bernie girl, okay boomer,
No.
okay boomer. Okay,
is that where that came from? That phrase?
No. She used the phrase which was already out there.
Okay.
But she was wearing, it was this girl. She was dancing. She was wearing a Bernie shirt, and she kept saying "Okay, boomer," and it turned into like this viral video. But the meme that I saw was a cartoon of her in that video, sort of drawn into a cartoon, saying "Okay, boomer," and then like it was like 6 months later, like 8 months later, whatever it is, her like standing in line to go vote with her head down, wearing her Bernie shirt, and it's like this like grudging, like okay, I guess we're going to vote for Joe, but the fervor's not there, and it's noticeable. And it feels reminiscent of 2004.
Yeah. So the polls seem to indicate that Biden's going to win. But like I think people learned their lesson in 2016, so they're not jumping on it. But I feel like there's this like silent majority. So there's people who are like for Trump because there's this fear. The rhetoric I see in our communities is that if you're openly for Trump, you're going to get canceled.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting because he's the sitting president. Like he actually won. I mean, you could argue about, he didn't win the popular vote. I'm like,
yeah,
well, that's the system. That's how the system works.
We have an electoral college,
right?
Yeah.
I just find that really interesting. Do you have any predictions?
You know what? In 2016, I thought Trump was going to win. I voted for Jill Stein in 2016. I had like a similar sort of feeling as you mentioned having now. It's just like, I don't really want to vote for either the two big parties, and I don't feel excited about either. I mean, I didn't feel excited about Hillary. I absolutely despised Donald Trump. My son was born in 2016, and thinking about the world that he was coming into, like really like put a lot of hatred of Donald Trump into my heart. He terrified my wife. I'll never forget, like the day after my son was born, I had gone out. We were still in the hospital. I had gone out to get some food, and I came back in, and my wife was crying, and I was like, oh my God, what happened? And I was like, is the baby okay? And he was fine, but she had been on her phone and she read like one of the many news stories that year that came out of like some hate crime against a Muslim. Mm-hmm. And she just looked at me and she said, "What kind of world did we just bring our son into?" So, I mean, that really colored my view of Donald Trump for quite a long time. And so, I mean, there's no way I was voting for him, right? But, you know, I didn't feel excited about it, so I just voted third party. Jill Stein was the Green Party candidate. But I thought Trump would win anyway. It was just like taking like a temperature test of his base versus Hillary's base. It was clear that his base was much more fired up than Hillary's. And
I felt like Hillary had a base, though.
She had a base.
Unlike Biden.
She had a base, yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Because they say that Hillary was the worst candidate of all time, etc. And so Biden's not going to deal with that. But when you look at, somebody posted something about Biden, like a compilation of all his gaffes. And it's hilarious.
Yeah.
You know?
Hilarious and bizarre. Yeah. It's really weird.
But I feel like during the primary season, I remember when I did the interview with Mustafa a year ago, he was pushing for Beto. He's a Texas guy, so he's pushing for Beto O'Rourke because he felt like Beto would take Texas and no Republican was ever going to win the presidency if they lost Texas. Mm-hmm. But you saw a base around Bernie. You saw a base around even Tulsi Gabbard, right? I'd meet people who like Tulsi Gabbard. Yeah. I met people who like Pete Buttigieg, right? I never met anybody who actually was for Joe Biden.
No, you don't. And it says, honestly, like if I were like a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, which I'm not, I've voted Democrat before, but I'm not loyal to the party by any means. But if I was, I would feel like incredibly abused right now. You look at what they did to Bernie in New York in 2016, where they called it for Hillary before counting all of the votes. And it was very clear that there was manipulation going on behind the scenes at the DNC to get him out of the race and to assimilate his base into the party to vote for Hillary. They did the same thing, which really it shook my faith in Bernie as like a politician because he let them do the same thing to him in 2020. But no, this is what the Democratic Party has been doing. Like they had an opportunity after the 2016 election. There was this apparent moment of like soul searching where they were looking for like a new chair of the DNC, and Keith Ellison was a potential candidate, and he represented like a very different demographic and a very different approach, but it was very clear that he was marginalized by the status quo in the DNC, and they got one of Obama's guys. Mm-hmm. And so like what appears to be going on, like to me in the DNC, is that like the people who are in control of the party are unwilling to let the party evolve and actually represent the people who have traditionally voted for them. And so you keep getting Joe Bidens, you keep getting Hillary Clintons as their presidential candidates because they keep talking about like the average age of the presidential candidate like rising. Like this is the oldest race that we've had, right? Both between Biden and Trump, and between like all of the candidates in the Democratic primaries. There was a very high age, and it's like this is something that may be interesting to talk about, but like. Class warfare, I think, has taken on a generational aspect. Class warfare has become generational warfare. And you can see it in the types of power struggles that go on inside the DNC. You can see it a lot of other places too. But yeah, that's why, why would you be fired up about Joe Biden? He's been in DC for 40 years. And whatever he would hope to accomplish as a politician, he probably should have accomplished it by now. To say nothing of his mental state, right? It's just it's a little embarrassing. And if I was a diehard Democrat, like I would feel like
kind of stabbed in the back,
slapped in the face, like all of it.
What I was going to ask you this, is that, so you mentioned your fear of Trump in 2016.
Yeah.
Has he lived, like, what has been your assessment from that point of view? Because people, the thing about it, I feel like Trump now is a known commodity, right?
Yeah.
So now the detractors of Trump are trying to paint this picture, because people who are trying to push people, there's almost like, I feel like there's a bullying effect going on right now.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that I didn't even vote, like, I was criticized for it because, like, oh, you're just downplaying the danger of Donald Trump. Well, to me, okay, the data set is out on Donald Trump. We know what he's done in the last 4 years, right? And to me, maybe I'm missing something here, but, like, has it been that bad because of him? Is what I'm asking. Because I want to talk about, you want to talk about police brutality? That was happening under Obama. The Tea Party rose under Obama.
Yeah.
So I'm not seeing, he had the whole Muslim ban thing, which was like kind of like a quick thing that he busted out in the beginning, and it's caused issues for people I know.
Yeah.
But there hasn't been any new war. Like, people are talking about, like, has there been new wars? I don't know. I don't think so.
No.
Unless I missed something.
No.
There's always people say, like, well, there's actually a war that he started no one knows about, or you hear about. Apparently, now there's a discussion about whether he's been less transparent about drone attacks.
Mm-hmm.
So there's arguments back and forth because everyone's talking about Obama being a drone guy and Trump is still doing it. I don't know, but so it, so you can argue that point, but I just don't see, but and that's gonna be with a lot of U.S. presidents, right? But I just don't see to a point where it's so bad where, like, people are, like, not going to be friends with, like, I feel like it's that kind of rhetoric. Like, I can't be friends with you if you're going to vote for Donald Trump.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't think Donald Trump is our friend, but I also don't think he's our enemy. And that's saying quite a lot post 9/11. He enacted the Muslim ban, and I know people who have been affected by that. I don't like it. But I think on the whole, like, if you sort of do like a cost-benefit analysis of his presidency for us as Muslims, I think that there is a case to be made that his nationalist agenda has actually been quite good for us. What I mean by that is he effectively ended the war on terror, right? Like, he pulled us out of Afghanistan. He has pretty much got us out of the Middle East. He's still supporting the Saudis who are at war in Yemen. But in terms of, like, America being like the world police, and being this global empire, like, that's not part of his agenda, and that is actually something that works in our favor. And I think that there are so many issues that we have dealt with domestically in this country that are downstream effects of the war on terror. Like, so much of the paranoia on, like, the part of the FBI, DHS, that looks at us as potential enemy combatants in the context of the war on terror, like, has led to, like, the infiltration of our masajid, and led to, like, the surveillance that, like, we joke, right? Like, when we say something like slightly off color in a private conversation, we say, haha, just kidding, FBI. But it's like a real, like, we assume that they're listening to us, right? And, that is all a downstream effect of the war on terror. Not to say that none of that existed before, but it's certainly intensified after 2001. And the fact that, like, Trump effectively ended the war on terror, I think, is a huge benefit for us. And, so, like, is he our friend? No, but, like, I think he has a view of the world and an agenda that is working in our favor in many respects. And that's a difficult thing to say, like you said. I mean, there's a certain orthodoxy around Trump that is very hard to break. which is why I wanted to lead into answering your question by, like talking about like, I didn't vote for Trump in 2016. Like, I did not like him. I still do not like as a person, like, would I want to hang out? Like, no. Right? Would I let him anywhere near my wife? Hell no. Like, but like, do I think his record shows that he is going to continue the status quo that has been so detrimental for us over the past 2 decades? Also, no. I think it's pretty clear that he is not interested in us. And for a group in this country that has been surveilled and demonized and imprisoned, it's very nice to have a lack of interest in you on the part of the
Muslim
state.
ban aside, but like Muslim ban in general is probably like a fraction of the overall policies that have affected Muslims negatively, right? And a Muslim ban in general is like, we're talking about mostly non-citizens here, right? Is that
right? Yeah,
you know what I'm saying? So I think it's kind of like every country has policies. I could see the argument. It's not. I don't like it either.
It definitely screwed a bunch of people over.
Right.
I mean, there. You heard stories of people who were like about to get on the plane, to come over here to immigrate, and then his ban went into effect. I mean, I'm not saying that he's done no harm to Muslims. But like, find me a president who hasn't done harm to Muslims.
Right.
Like, Obama intensified the drone war, right? Obama continued the war on terror very, very intensely. I think it's much easier to trace continuity between presidents than actual changes in policy. So like the fact that Trump actually managed to end the war on terror is actually pretty monumental.
Yeah.
In my opinion, like there is a military-industrial complex in this country that is very displeased with him, and there's a lot of money that he has cost them. Like, it's hard to just shut that down, but he did, and I can at least acknowledge that works in our favor.
Interestingly enough, it's like especially Muslims. So Muslims, how they vote has always been like, so African American Muslims have pretty much been Democrats, right? And Muslims with immigrant backgrounds, I guess, used to vote more Republican, pre 9/11 kind of thing, and then afterward. So, but because of Bush, and almost like foreign policy was the number one issue. So as like my previous guest, Steve Cutler for the Republican Party pointed out, he's like, you guys wanted someone who was better on foreign policy. That was a primary objective. So there you go. In a way, he obviously is not completely out of it, but I think Trump's ideologically he's an isolationist. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I used to identify as a Republican, and one of the reasons was that the old Republican Party used to be more isolationist. Like, you're talking about the 60s and 70s. The neocons came in and changed all that, but you're talking about a guy like Barry Goldwater, right? So anyways, so we talked about you're from Georgia. Savannah?
Near Savannah. Yeah,
Near Savannah.
Very close to Savannah.
Savannah's interesting. I've been to Savannah. Savannah has this, is when you're growing up in the U.S. and you read about like your traditional classy southern cities, like you hear about a Savannah, Georgia. You think about like Spanish moss and antebellum homes and all that kind of stuff. So I went in 2009, did like a road trip through the South. I actually wasn't like that impressed with it, with the city. I was more impressed with Charleston. But how was it like growing up in Savannah? Is that, or outside of, were you like a suburb of Savannah, or is it like another small city?
So Savannah's on the coast.
Okay.
And I live about an hour south of Savannah, and I grew up on an island called St. Simon's. Okay. There's a lot of barrier islands on the coast of Georgia, so I grew up on one of them.
This is on the Atlantic Ocean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But, Savannah is where I go for Juma when I'm at home, visiting my parents. And yeah, I mean, what was it like? Growing up on that island was sort of even like an atypical experience from like growing up elsewhere in Georgia, because it's, it's a resort. It's like a vacation spot for a lot of people. So it's a very different place from like when I would go to visit my grandmother's. Like my mom's mother lives in Claxton, Georgia. which you've probably never heard of, but it's the fruitcake capital of the world, which is their claim to fame. But no, it's this little town in the middle of the country in Georgia, which, so totally different world from what I experienced growing up. But it was great, it was a beautiful place. It was a great place to grow up. It, interestingly, ended up playing a big role in the path that I took in life after I became Muslim, because I became sort of fascinated with what I learned about the history of enslaved African Muslims. Just north of St. Simon's Island is Sapelo Island, which had a plantation there where there was an entire family of Muslims. The head of the family was named Bilali Muhammad. This is something I learned after I became Muslim, but it led me on this whole path, to go to graduate school and study that. But it's had profound effects on my life, but in ways that were very, very unexpected.
So would you say it wasn't a traditional Southern upbringing?
In some ways it was, in some ways it wasn't. Both my parents are from the country.
Okay.
They sort of moved to St. Simon's as this very sort of aspirational thing. We're going to go live on the beach. It's going to be different from the farm.
And
which is where
what kind of work were your folks into?
So I always say I was surrounded by the law growing up.
Okay.
My dad's an attorney. My mother was a juvenile probation officer. She used to do background checks on all my friends. But yeah, my mom's from Claxton, my dad's from Darien, which is just up the road from St. Simon's. But they grew up in very rural settings. So I have very Southern parents. I grew up in a Southern environment, but that was, sort of unique from the rest of the South in many ways.
I see. And now I know you grew up practicing, you're Episcopalian.
That's right.
Right? Yeah. So that's if I understand it, is that it's the Protestant branch that is similar to Catholicism. Is that a good way to frame it?
Yeah, you've probably heard the story of King Henry VIII. He kept executing his wives because they weren't, giving birth to sons. Have you heard this story?
I actually haven't heard that story.
Okay,
but it doesn't sound like it's something that's abnormal.
No. So this is,
in that time.
This happened around the time of the Protestant Reformation, but King Henry VIII broke off from the Catholic Church because the Pope eventually sent him a letter. He was like, you can't keep killing your wives because they're not giving you sons. So he was killing them because divorce is not permitted in the Catholic Church, right? So he basically told the Pope to go kick rocks, and he's like, I'll have my own church. I'll be the head of the church in England. So that was the genesis of the Church of England, of which the Queen of England is still the head today.
Isn't that more Anglican?
Yeah, so the Episcopal Church is the American branch of the Anglican Church.
Okay, so you're saying we won't find Anglicans in America?
You will. So it's think of it as genus and species, right? The genus is Anglican. The Anglican Church is now a global church, thanks to the British Empire.
God save the Queen.
Yeah, I'm not going to say amen to that, but she's all right, whatever. But the Episcopal Church is just the name of the Anglican Church in America, and it has that different name, I would imagine. I don't actually know, but because of the Revolutionary War, we kept the religion, but we didn't identify with England anymore. It was sort of an awkward position to be in. Church of England, we just fought a revolution. We're here in America. So they called it the Episcopal Church, but it's the Anglican Church. It's part of the global Anglican Church. Yeah, and so it's very similar to Catholicism, I think, because King Henry VIII wasn't leaving the Catholic Church for the reasons that Luther, posted his theses for it. Like, he wasn't concerned about indulgences. He was concerned about getting a son. And so, like, he didn't have such a problem with, like, the hierarchy and, like, the liturgy of the Catholic Church. So much of that was retained in the Anglican Church. So it's very similar. If you go to, like, an Anglican service and a Catholic service, it'll be very similar.
Gotcha. Now, what was your experience like? Did your folks emphasize religion as a kid?
Yeah, I was an altar boy.
Okay.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
It means, so there's at the beginning of the service, there's a procession up to the altar, and, like, someone's holding a cross. There are, like, two people holding torches. One person is, like, carrying the gospel, and then you walk in with the priests and the deacons up to the altar, and you all sit down. And it's like a thing. It's a way for kids to participate, right? So I did all that stuff. I, like, carried the torches and the cross and the gospel on different occasions. So yeah, I was very involved in the church growing up.
You know, I remember you were telling me, and I can't recall, like, you actually had aspirations to become, like, a pastor or get into, like, theological work in Christianity?
Yeah.
Okay, talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
I'll let you get a sip of coffee. I know you're like, it seemed like you were aiming for that cup. Go for it. Are you done?
No, yeah, I'll take a sip.
I don't want to. Every time I see Will picking a cup up, I'm like, I ask him a question. He's got to talk.
No, it's all good. Yeah, so I mean, one of my, like, big role models was actually the priest at that church. He was, interestingly enough, he was a Catholic priest before he came over to the Anglican Church. But yeah, he was a fantastic man, and you know, was very, like, you know, he was a person of spirituality, of the spiritual path. And that really, like, showed in his life. And I was just very attracted to that from an early age. Really admired him a lot. Spent a lot of time with him, like, learning from him. And so, you know, as I got older, like, became a teenager and was trying to decide what to do with my life, I decided, you know, I would like to be a priest like him. So that's what I planned to do when I went to college. I studied philosophy and took a lot of courses in religious studies. I studied Hebrew because I was told by the seminary. I was hanging out with seminarians when I was in college because there's a seminary there at my school.
You went to Emory?
Emory, okay. Yeah, that's right. So
You must have done pretty well in high school then to get into that college. That's a pretty tough school to get into, I hear.
Yeah, it's probably even harder today, but I did okay. Yeah. Yeah, so, but, you know, the seminarians told me, like, we study Greek. That's the language we study, because it's the language of the New Testament. We study Greek in seminary, and we don't ever study any Hebrew. And I was like, okay, I'll study Hebrew. So I started taking courses. They only had modern Hebrew, so that's what I did. But I took courses in Hebrew when I was in college. And yeah, I mean, that was very much my path. That's what I planned to do for the longest time. But obviously, that didn't work out. I ended up becoming Muslim, much to everyone's surprise.
Well, I don't want. I think you've alluded to it. I think people who were, like, tuning in now are like, "Yeah, Will's Muslim," but I want to explore a little bit about that transition because that just doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting looking back on it because the farther you get from it, the more threads of that decision you can kind of, like, pull apart and actually look at.
Sure.
At the time, it just felt very much like my own spiritual journey and, like, this process that I was going through. And, you know, now that I have some distance from it, I see, like, you know, there's actually, like, it wasn't just, like, the spiritual quest, right? Like, there was a lot of different, you know, social and political and theological, like, things that I was working out in my own mind that led to that decision. But, you know, looking back, I would say one of the big ones was when I was in high school, my church actually went through a schism, like it split over an issue. And the issue was the ordination of a homosexual bishop. And so, there was a camp that was okay with this, there was a camp that was not okay with it. And, it was a big deal. I think I was maybe like a junior or a senior in high school when this happened. And my church stayed in the camp that was okay with it. And the church that I ended up attending at college was also in that camp. And what I noticed, I kind of have like a way to describe it now, but I noticed that this was sort of like, at the time, it just was sort of clear that this had changed something about the branch of the church. Like, it wasn't just about accepting a homosexual bishop as a legitimate ordination. It led to a lot of other like theological, it's a nice way to say this, like
issues,
chicanery.
I don't know. What does that really know what that means? It's like an academic
antics, like nonsense. So I knew the priests, right? I had very close relationships with priests, and what I started to notice after getting to know many of them was that they had wildly divergent theological understandings of like who God is, who Christ was, alayhi salam. Like, for one thing, there was not a sense of like shared belief even amongst the priesthood. And on the other, we have a creed. And it's the same creed that the Catholics use. It's called the Nicene Creed. It was written in like the year 300.
Isn't that for all Protestants as well? Like, isn't that for pretty much all?
I think so.
All of modern Trinitarian Christianity.
I think so.
Okay.
Although we read it in church. We would read it every Sunday. Mm-hmm. There was a part in the service where we would stand up and say the Nicene Creed together. And I knew that like most of these priests up at the altar did not actually believe in the Nicene Creed. And it even got to the point where they started like interpolating like certain parts of the creed. I remember one priest in my church in Atlanta we always referred to God as God our Father, right? Because that's how Jesus refers to him in the Gospels. She started calling God the Great Father Mother. And I was like, okay, I know why she's doing that, but why does she feel comfortable doing that? Like, why does she feel comfortable basically changing a creed that Christians have been saying for 1,700 years? And why is she up there reading parts of the creed that I know she doesn't believe in? That was a very, jarring thing for me, because I was asking myself, like, what exactly am I signing up for? So that's what sort of pushing me out of the church.
Okay.
We good, by the way?
Yeah, I have a question on, okay. So when I dialogue with, a couple things here. We talk about spiritual journey. And one of the things that when I listen to people talk about spiritual journeys, like, I think we're all on a spiritual journey, right? At the end of the day. But then when you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew, I think a lot of us, we're pretty much like, say for me, like within the religion of Islam, I follow different like paths, like Salafism, maybe something more traditional, exploring Sufism, etc., things of that sort. But it is off limits for me to even think about exploring like Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, etc. You seem to have been comfortable enough to like, I assume for Christians it's similar, right? Because a Christian might negotiate certain aspects, right? They might switch denominations. They might go from a Catholic denomination to a non-denominational kind of. You hear that fairly commonly. It doesn't seem to be that problematic for them. But for them to jump out of it is a completely different beast. Like, what does it take for someone to like their spiritual journey to like almost go outside the box? You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, I mean, for one thing, it takes realizing that the people who actually are like the authorities and the representatives of the religion do not themselves believe in it as they claim to. That's sort of like,
they won't say that publicly though.
No, they won't. But I mean, this is a very, it's like an open secret amongst seminarians that you go to seminary to have all your beliefs destroyed. That the Bible has been so deconstructed over the past century through new modes of like textual criticism, that people who go to seminary do not come out with their like quote unquote naive beliefs intact about anything. And so, I was friends with seminarians. I was becoming aware of this. And I was actually sort of like, left-leaning theologically. Like I was open to like progressive interpretations of what we believed. I was open to like a certain amount of like fluidity. But what was really problematic for me was hypocrisy. Like if you don't believe it, don't get up there and claim to believe it. Okay. Right? Get up there and say what you believe. And, justify to me how this is actually consistent and continuous with the teachings of Jesus, alayhi salam, right? Like do something like that rather than just saying the creed because I guess you have to do it. And, privately, and everyone who knows you knows that you don't actually believe it. That's not sincere, right? So, I mean, there was that. There was also, like, through my Hebrew studies, I was becoming aware that there was a way of understanding who Jesus was that I had never had access to. So much of what he says in the Gospels is actually referencing the Torah or a commentary on something in the Jewish law. And this is something that like most, even like educated like seminarians, priests cannot tell you. Because again, they don't read Hebrew. They're not familiar with Judaism whatsoever. And for example, like there is this passage in one of the Gospels where Jesus instructs his disciples to go into I think it was a field of wheat, because they were hungry, and to pick the wheat. But he was criticized for doing this because it was on the Sabbath, and that was considered work. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, right? But if you read the text, the way that he instructs his disciples to do it is not to break the grains of wheat out of their sheaves with their fingers. That is what's considered work according to the Jewish law. What they did is they got it in between the palms of their hands, and they sort of rubbed it together until it fell apart. And they picked the grains of wheat up off the ground and ate them like that. So they had not technically done work. So Jesus had not technically instructed his disciples to break the Sabbath. And yet, the Christian interpretation of this that I heard growing up was that, Jesus was the fulfillment of the law himself. So the law was invalid after his life and his mission. And so he could instruct his disciples to break the law. But in fact, he did not do that. He gave them a sort of subtle workaround. This is the type of thing that I was learning. I was learning about Jesus from Jews, I guess, is the short way of like saying that. Like, and I started to think, well, if Jews can teach me something about Jesus that Christians cannot, well, then I have a much broader horizon to work with here.
Sure. So on that point, and then I think the interpretation that Christians would also say is that, well, that's why the Jews would say he's blaspheming because he's not following the Sabbath. Would that be an accurate statement as well on that specific example?
Yeah. So I mean, the Pharisees, who are sort of like the villains of the Gospels, they're like the proto rabbis. Yeah. And they're like constantly like Jesus's opponents.
That's where Paul was a Pharisee, right?
Paul was a Pharisee. Jesus was a Pharisee.
Okay.
I mean, interestingly enough.
Okay.
But he sort of set up as like, he's trying to like, he's Christ, he's the Messiah, and he's like constantly sort of in the struggle with the Pharisees. So yeah, they criticized him. The Pharisees criticized him in the Gospels for doing that, but it's clear from the original language, from the Greek of the Gospels, that he instructed them to do that in a way that did not in fact break the Sabbath. That was something that I learned from like contemporary Jews, like today. So you know, that sort of like opened up my horizons, and I realized like I have a lot to learn from non-Christians about this. Because I was a Christian, I believed, but you know, I was very interested in Jesus for that reason. I was like, I have something to learn about Jesus from non-Christians. So I mean, that opens a door for you where you become open to other interpretations.
When I engage with Christians, and sometimes if it gets into like more like a debate kind of thing, I just say, hey, listen, I think that you and I can both agree that Jesus Christ is someone to be respected and followed, right? Mm-hmm. So based on that, the goal should be to find out what was he really about. Mm-hmm. And then let that conclusion drive us. If we can agree to that, the problem. So for me, I was having a discussion with a friend a few years back, and I was asked, like, do you think Islam has fatal flaws? Because like as a Christian, I think they were willing to kind of acknowledge that, maybe not acknowledge it, but I said, hey, I think Christianity has a fatal flaw. I think there's a few fatal flaws. For me, if a Christian were to come to ask me something, a Trinitarian Christian, if someone was, because I've come across Unitarians now. I think there's Sir Anthony Buzzard. I think he lives in Georgia. Mm-hmm. So they believe that they're almost like Aryans in a way, mm-hmm. but maybe not quite, but obviously more similar to Muslims. I'd love to get one of them on the show. But for me, the issue is this. If a Christian would be like, you know, trying to proselytize to me, this like, it comes down to this, like why I wouldn't accept Christianity. It's not the Trinity from a philosophical point of view. Like, I think it's impossible, but at the same time, I'm open to the idea that God could be of a nature that's impossible to understand. Mm-hmm. But there has to be some clear guidance about that, right? Yeah. So to me, it comes down to this. Jesus died, he was crucified in 33 AD, right? Mm-hmm. And then the New Testament was canonized, you know, Gospel of John. If you're going to date it late, we'll go like 90. Mm-hmm. The other books, like Paul's letters, will come in the 50, 40 range. But then the Council of Nicaea happens 325. Mm-hmm. It's a good 300 years. Where they codify, where they then say that they talk about Jesus' divinity. Yeah. That's codified. So to me, this is the issue. So for 300 years, there's obviously a discussion about the nature of Jesus. Mm-hmm. So, and the New Testament was there. So to me, it can't be crystal clear in the New Testament. Because the early church was discussing it. Yeah. And then you think about the politics involved. Constantine summons these bishops to the Council of Nicaea. Yeah,
I believe Arius was there.
Yeah, he was there. Well. Right. But it's like, did he get them all? Were there other groups, were they all represented? There's also the angle to think about that. Some of these Roman emperors didn't mess around. Like, if you didn't agree, you might get your head cut off. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So all that in play, what I tell Christians who are like so gung-ho on the Trinity is, listen, I could respect the fact if you guys were open to other interpretations of Jesus' divinity or lack of divinity within Christianity, I could buy that, right? Because the Trinity, I think, is an interpretation. But they're so quick to say, if I said, like, I don't know if you ever heard of that guy named Dr. Dale Tuggy? No. He has a podcast called The Trinity's Podcast, and he basically is a former Trinitarian. So he believes Jesus is the Son of God. He's created. He's not pre-eternal, right? And he believes he gets that from the New Testament. And I think that when you read the New Testament, you can certainly derive it, because even a Trinitarian would not be able to, they'll quote something like, before Abraham was, I am. And I'm like, why didn't he say before Adam was, I am? I was thinking about that the other day. Mm-hmm. Like, Adam is the first creation of humanity, right?
Yeah.
Like that made, I was just thinking about that the other day. I was like, why Abraham? Why did he say Abraham? Why didn't he say Adam? And as Muslims, we believe this whole idea of like the creation of the souls from the backs of Adam and Arafah.
Yeah.
Right? So there's like interpretation that could even coincide within our tradition that coincide with that. They could like rectify that. That maybe Jesus' soul was before Abraham's soul. Whatever that meant. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But to me, that becomes like what I call the fatal flaw. Because Christians in America, Unitarians are such a small fringe minority. They're all Trinitarians, and I'll say, listen, like if the Trinity if you have to believe in this to be a Christian, I just don't get it. It doesn't add up. It doesn't. The fact that you guys, your church fathers discussed it for 300 years, is essentially for me proof that it's not what Jesus taught.
Yeah.
That's because if the crux of it, if we can agree, again, if the goal is to follow Jesus, right?
Yeah.
They would say yes. Now, but you also have to believe in this Trinity. That if you don't believe in this Trinity, you're not a Christian. Then I don't see the connection.
Well, yeah. I mean, there wouldn't have been a discussion about it had it been a settled issue from the get-go, right? I mean, like we didn't discuss the subtleties of Tawheed, or we didn't debate Tawheed for 300 years because it was a settled issue from the very beginning.
Sure.
So yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's brave of you to have these discussions. I've never had much success with them in my experience. So it's just, generally speaking, I don't go there with Christians.
How come? Like I see you because you could be that guy with your background. And what's your Ph.D. in, by the way?
My Ph.D. is in religious studies, but it focuses on the history of Islam in America.
Okay.
This is a topic that I've just sort of read about out of personal interest. I mean, it's something I was reading about when I was still Christian. Yeah,
okay. But like, I would see because someone with your background, you came up through the church, like the Muslim apologetics would love to have someone like you on a debate stage, but at the same time, I don't see you as a debating kind of guy. That's not your personality, right? Would you say, or
I think debates can be interesting for people who enjoy that and either doing it themselves or like consuming it. I think that generally speaking, they're unproductive for changing people's minds who are not looking to have their mind changed or who are not open, at least, to having their mind changed. I don't think, you actually, even if you present like a very cogent argument for anything, if someone is not willing to hear you out and to actually entertain what you have to say to them, then it makes no difference what you say. In my experience, and from what I've seen, like it just makes no difference. And from what I've seen, there is no willingness to really talk about what happened at the Council of Nicaea, right? And if there is, there's this overwhelming like sentiment that, well, that was also guided by God, right?
Yeah.
Right. So I also had numerous like traumatic experiences with evangelical Christians growing up.
While you're still a Christian?
While I was still a Christian,
okay.
Yeah. Like even like Christians who were not pleased with my Episcopalianism, right? Because it wasn't.
You weren't born again?
I wasn't born again. Yeah. I tried to be born again once.
What is it? So okay,
I tried it out.
Okay.
But
I have a question about that because I know some guys that are Pentecostals.
Yeah.
Okay. They're actually on my show before. So people can refer. But I watch them on. I sometimes they'll live stream their street preaching, right? So I'll get alert. I'll tune in. I'm just sitting around watching a football game and they're street preaching. So I'll turn it on and see what they say. So they're like, "Hey, do you believe in Jesus?" And then like, "Yeah." And they're like, "Oh, are you born again?" They'll go through a list of questions.
Yeah.
And then they'll quote like someone who's not born again is not really a real Christian.
Yeah.
So what's that all about?
Well, being born again is, I think traditionally it was understood as being baptized into the church, right? So, we Episcopalians baptize our babies, and then that's it. Then you're in the church and you're a Christian. So, it differs from the evangelical notion that it has to be sort of this conscious moment of like repentance and turning to Christ and asking Him to come into your life. And, it was always actually like unclear exactly what was supposed to happen at that moment of being born again. But you're supposed to like ask Jesus to come into your life and to save you from your sins. It has to be like something that you choose to do. And I would say like as an adult, like almost like as a consenting adult, but kids do it too. Teenagers do it. Kids younger than that do it. So, I actually tried it. I was like, these evangelicals like are really fervent. I was like, maybe they're on to something. I went to a tent revival one summer, and I just...
As a teenager?
Yeah, I was a teenager.
Okay.
I was like, I'll try it out, see what happens, right? I followed the protocol. It was very Episcopalian of me. Like we have like steps in our liturgy.
Yeah.
Like you stand, you kneel, you stand, you kneel, you go up to the altar. Like it's the same every time. I was like, I'll follow the playbook, right? Mm-hmm. So I did it, and I didn't particularly feel anything. I was like, I don't feel any more saved than I did before. I already believed in Jesus.
Yeah. Was that thing where you had to speak in tongues too?
That happens sometimes in the Episcopal Church as well.
Okay.
But you don't have to speak in tongues. You just have to like ask Christ to come into your life. I don't know.
So you did that, but you were like, all right, but from your vantage point,
I was unimpressed. I was unimpressed with being born again. I was like, this feels like just being born. I feel no different. I kept waiting. I was like waiting for this like change to come
like
over
the Holy
me.
Spirit to overtake you kind of thing, or
Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned the whole thing about how the Council of Nicaea is guided by God and etc. Because I think the Catholics have this whole thing where the church is actually a source of revelation.
Yes.
In a way,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So the Catholics can have that argument, but then when the Protestants, the same Pentecostal guy, will talk about how the Catholic is doomed to hell.
Yeah.
But then is cherry picking the Catholics' like understanding, right? So again, it seems like an inconsistent nature. But I had a conversation with a professor at UNC Chapel Hill named Dr. Hugo Mendez. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him.
No.
He actually went to UGA for his undergrad, but he's probably more like our age. He's a younger colleague of Dr. Bart Ehrman, and he identifies as a Byzantine Catholic.
Okay.
But he wrote an article recently in some journal of the New Testament talking about how he believed the Johannine community didn't really exist. And I guess the crux of that argument, he says on my show, which people who listen to this show can reference that one, he says that he believes the Gospel of John is forged. Straight up. And I'm like, so would you say the Gospel of John is not God's word? He's like, no, I wouldn't say that. And I think the way he tried to articulate was, even though it's forged, so forgery indicates to me like somebody wrote it with the intent to attribute it to the disciple John.
Yeah.
And then even though he tried to forge it, it was that person with this motive was still guided by God.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I was like, yeah. And he's because he's someone who studied in the academy, and he's seen some of the different angles of textual criticism and whatnot, and so it's more probably left leaning. Mm-hmm. So he has that flexibility to like negotiate things. But I'm like, how far do you want to go? It's almost like, because if you use that line of logic, pretty much anything goes, I would think.
Well, yeah.
But for you, you also had a progressive line of thinking. So I always figured that, well, you'd always stay Christian because your sphere of Christianity would be so vast, you could like negotiate it.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it came back to what to me seemed to be hypocrisy.
Okay.
Yeah, like I was open to sort of creative interpretation, but I wanted what you say matters, and what the intention behind what you say also matters, and it matters a great deal. And if your intentions are not sincere, then if you say you believe something and you do not, then for someone like me, like that's just not going to fly. That will push me out. And it did. It pushed me out. So I remember I went to the Catholic chaplain, who was a priest, when I was at Emory.
Okay.
And I think I put him in a really awkward position because he has a relationship with all the other chaplains. But I went to him and I was like, I told him everything I told you, and I was like, thinking about becoming Catholic. That was my first sort of like notion. It was like, okay, I'll go to the Christians who actually believe what they say. And I was like, they say the Nicene Creed, but I don't think they really believe it. And I'm thinking about becoming Catholic.
The Episcopalians, so let's go to the Catholics. Okay.
Yeah. And I think, he didn't want to just say, yeah, come on over to the Catholic Church, because then it's going to look like, he's like poaching the Episcopalians, and he has a relationship with like the Episcopal chaplain, who I loved, and she was great, by the way. And she's not guilty of most of like what actually ended up pushing me out of the church. But, so he just sort of...
Is Emory, by the way, kind of a Christian inclined school? Or like
not really. Officially it's Methodist.
Okay, it's a liberal arts college, right?
Yeah,
but
yeah.
okay, it's kind of like how Loyola's Jesuit, but in Chicago. But
yeah, right.
You've got people who okay. So anyways, so you go to the Catholic chaplain, then what?
He just tells me to like take it slow, and I think he just tried to chill me out and like get me out the door, frankly.
Okay.
That did occur to me, like stay within like the broader tradition of Christianity. Although I reached a point where I wasn't looking to be creative anymore, like theologically. I was sort of done with the creativity because it just seemed to wreck everything that it touched. So I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll just go to people who actually say what they believe and believe what they say. And it's very clear. It's like very cut and dry. I had not developed problems with the Trinity by this point.
Okay.
I had not really, I had not begun to disbelieve in what I was raised to believe in at the very beginning there. But, it just, I sort of realized that there was nowhere to turn like institutionally. And as I was sort of like coming to this awareness that like my horizon is much broader than I originally thought it was, I was just like, okay, I'm going to step away from the church. Maybe I'll come back. At first it was like, I'll step away, maybe I'll come back someday. But eventually it became clear to me, like, no, I just really don't believe this anymore. I don't know what I believe yet, but I'm not identifying as a Christian any longer.
How did your family take that? Was that something they
I didn't tell them.
Okay.
I didn't tell them. They were sending me to college to be a priest, and I was enjoying college.
Yeah.
As much as I wanted to be a priest, I let's just say I enjoyed college.
So your undergraduate was in philosophy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Emory's in Atlanta. So, anyways, you went to Jerusalem, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah,
when does Jerusalem come into play?
That's my senior year.
Okay.
And I went there to study Hebrew. I was at the Hebrew University. And by that point, well, when I signed up to go, I was out of the church for the most part, but was
and
still
also
sort of
saying
searching.
not say you're a Christian too. You kind of were like, I'm not really a Christian anymore either.
Yeah, not that I was telling people. It's just where it was internally.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I had not yet, when I decided to go, I had not yet found Islam. I had not started reading about it. However, in the interim, because you sign up like a year in advance.
Okay,
right?
so what was your take on, so were you in a position where you were like, I'm done with the church, I'm not a Christian, but Jesus, I still like Jesus?
Yeah.
That's kind of like the internal thing.
Yeah. It's like, it was out of loyalty to Jesus that I felt I was leaving the church, right? Like out of, I never disbelieved in God.
Yeah.
And I never lost my love.
And you believe Jesus was still God at this point?
I was questioning that.
You're questioning. Okay.
I was questioning that. Yeah,
Okay.
I didn't know what I believed about that, but it was a belief that I no longer clung to tightly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it was in the interim between the time that I decided to go to Jerusalem and by the time that I actually left to go, mm-hmm. I was pretty darn sure I was going to be a Muslim.
How did you first come across Islam?
Purely through reading. Yeah, purely through reading. I was just, I was just searching, I was at that point where it was difficult to leave the church. And, I think that difficulty really pushed me to figure out what it is that I believe. So, I'm a very academic type of person. So my initial notion was I'm just going to read. I'm going to read about other religions and I'm going to see what seems right to me. I was already learning quite a bit about Judaism. Okay. And I was fascinated with it, honestly. I think maybe I sort of superficially believed that I might become Jewish at some point. I also had a Jewish girlfriend at the time that I was very much in love with. Mm-hmm. And that sort of helped that belief. But I think I always knew deep down that this is cool, but it's not for me.
Yeah.
This is very interesting. It's fascinating. But it was very clear even from my relationship with her that being Jewish was about having that background, being part of the tribe. And that's what it is, and if you're not, sure, you can convert, but it's you talk about your ancestors coming out of Egypt and it's well, mine were up in Scotland. So, so it never grabbed me.
Yeah.
But Islam grabbed me. And what I did is I think I read No God But God by Reza Aslan, which is weird thinking back on it. It was an okay book. But then I picked up a translation of the Quran and I was I'm just going to read it. Mm-hmm. I didn't know what I was doing, so I started at the beginning and I read it all the way to the back. Should have done it the other way around. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I started doing that, and really it was the process of reading the Quran that convinced me. I was oh yeah, I believe this. Oh yeah, this is what I already believe. Mm-hmm. Oh, this is kind of what I had already intuited about God and the prophets. Mm-hmm. And by the time that I actually finished, which was in Jerusalem, I made a promise to myself that I wouldn't make any decisions without finishing the entire Quran, mm-hmm. In translation, obviously. But I was whoa, what if there's something at the end that I really don't like, Yeah. But, it was really this sort of sense of coming awake to what you already believe. Okay. That's how it felt to me.
Sure.
And yeah, so I went through it, and I just felt very sort of convicted. It was interesting too. This is I just think this is funny. I just like to tell this story, sure, whether or not it's relevant. So my girlfriend was Jewish.
Okay.
And
did she go with you to Jerusalem?
No.
Okay.
No.
She was back in Georgia?
She was studying abroad in England.
Okay.
At the same time.
I see.
But, she came from a very, very Jewish family. And her parents did not like the fact that we were together.
Did your folks care that you're dating a Jewish girl?
They didn't care.
Okay.
I mean, they, I don't think they thought it was that serious. So
they
didn't care. Yeah, it's college. He's going to, get out and find someone else.
Sure.
But, we were talking one night about her parents. And I remember making a comment, about how it was a problem that I was Christian. I remember making this comment. I was well, at least I'm not Muslim.
Yeah.
Because that'd be even worse. And then I just kind of laughed, and I was that'll never happen. And it was less than a year later, I was Muslim. And so now I know to never say never about anything. Because if you could have told me no, actually in a year you will be Muslim, I would have laughed in your face. I was impossible.
At the time you were reading the Quran still?
No, I had not started reading the Quran yet.
Okay.
Like I that came later. Like, but you know, once I picked it up, I was like, you know, it was kind of like an offhand thing. I was like, I'm searching.
Yeah.
Like, why not check this out?
Yep.
3 Abrahamic faiths. Like,
And did you know that Islam had positions on Jesus?
I think I was aware of that.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it was the process of reading that really did it for me.
How did you feel about certain things? So, I look at what the apologetics, the debaters, and these folks say, right? So on the Christian side, you've got like the guys like David Wood and etc. He's always into. I don't think he's very good, but I still like listen to his argument just to hear it out, because then I hear people parrot the same argument.
Mm-hmm.
So, first of all, the narration of the crucifixion, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Quran pretty much denounces the crucifixion of Christ.
Yeah.
Christians treat it as like it happened, and they're like, historically we can attest to it as well, etc. When you read something like that, was that something like, well, the Quran is wrong about this?
No, I didn't have strong feelings about the crucifixion by that point.
Okay.
So I noted it. I was like, okay, that's interesting. I wonder why. It wasn't particularly like it wasn't a make or break issue for me. I was like, okay, so they have a different belief on the crucifixion, that it wasn't Jesus, it was someone else who was made to appear like him.
Sure.
Okay, I can accept that they believe that. That's not offensive to me, right? But I was more interested in other things, and one of them being, because by this point I had sort of been educated on things like the Council of Nicaea and things like that. I was like, okay, they believe in one God. It's very straightforward. Everything else is a creation of God.
Yeah.
Jesus is a creation of God. He was a prophet, and this is a category of people who are sort of like the best of creation, and they're people through whom others come to know God. I can kind of almost even see like where we as Christians made our mistake.
Yeah.
Is like it was almost like, there's this word like theophany, like this moment where God becomes, I won't say manifest, but you like sort of like the Musa alayhi salam encountering the burning bush.
Sure. That
was a theophany. Like prophets can maybe even be interpreted as like theophanies. Like this is how I was thinking of it at the time. This person through whom like their heart reflects the reality of God's existence so perfectly that you might fall into the mistake of worshiping the prophet themselves. Like it kind of like, it just started to click with me. And I was like, this makes a lot of sense. That was the type of thing that I was really looking for. Yeah, like the crucifixion was like, I was like, okay, so they don't believe it was him, fine.
Yeah.
But the descriptions of the prophets and the very familiar descriptions of like God and heaven and reward and punishment, that all sort of felt very familiar.
And you didn't have any issues as a Christian about like textual criticism and things of that sort?
I, as much as I understood at that point, like, I didn't know how. I was aware of the claim that the Quran was very rigorously authenticated. And I was sort of, I didn't have the chops to like verify that for myself at the time. But I sort of like felt like, okay, if Muslims feel comfortable like making this claim, and they've been able to hold on to it for 1,400 years, then there must be something about the Quran that is different from the Bible. And so that just sort of set me at ease.
I gotcha.
Not that I could go and like understand like what like tawatur is and things like that. Not at that point.
Right.
But I was aware that like Muslims were also cognizant that authentication of a holy scripture is an issue. at least they're aware of the issue, right? So I was like, that's great. Like, you know, you can at least attempt to cover that base. So I was like, great. You know, they're
right, because the idea is like basically like if you're claiming something is God's word, then you know the question you have to have something. You have to have traceability.
Yeah.
Right. I used to work in quality assurance. Right. You have to have traceability to your standard.
Yeah.
Right. As they say, when you're like, because like you know, because like okay, you can come. So this is God's word. I'm like, okay, this sounds good, right? But now, can you trace it back? That's the question. Do you become Muslim in Jerusalem then?
I did. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it just, and again, it doesn't see. I don't hear any stories about you actually meeting Muslims yet. It's just like what you're reading.
Yeah, you know, so because my girlfriend was Jewish, there was sort of like this common knowledge amongst her group of friends that I was making my exit from the church. It very much looked like I was going to become Jewish.
Okay.
And this narrative sort of emerged about me that, you know, was beyond my control. Like there's just this story about what I was going to do, like this like intensely personal thing that I was going through. People were like, oh yeah, this is what he's doing. He's going to become Jewish. That when I started reading about Islam, I didn't tell anyone. I felt very protective over that process, especially when it started speaking to me. And I was like, okay, maybe I do believe in this. Yeah. I'm not going to tell anyone. And I didn't. I didn't tell her. I didn't tell my girlfriend. I didn't tell my closest friends. It came as a surprise to absolutely everyone that I made this decision when I actually made it. And because I didn't want another story about me getting out there that I had no control over. I was like, I'm going to be in control of this, and you know, I'll let people know on my own terms. Which, you know, had its drawbacks. It was very jarring for a lot of people, especially the ones who thought I was going to become Jewish.
Oh, because were they Jews?
They were Jews, yeah. I mean,
they were like, oh, well, they're setting up your welcome party.
Yeah. I mean, really, really. Like, I mean, and they were great people. Yeah. They were very encouraging. But you know, they were like, okay, he's joining our team. And then I come back from Jerusalem, I'm Muslim, and you know, it was jarring for them. They're like, what the hell happened? Like,
at this point, were you still with your girlfriend, or?
Yeah, I mean, we both knew that our relationship wouldn't survive this.
Right.
You know, so we weren't exactly ready to call off the relationship, but it was pretty clear that it was over.
Right. She wasn't going to consider becoming Muslim, probably.
No. I told her, I was like, look, I'm good. Like, you know, I can be with you.
Yeah.
You can be Jewish. I'll be with you. But I knew that was not going to work for her. That was always very clear. From day one. So, you know, that was the end of that relationship.
At what point do your folks find out?
I tell them after I get back.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
by the time you get back, how many months were you Muslim? 6 months. Okay. So at that point in time, did you have a chance to like meet Muslims in the Holy Land?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I went, and, you know, it's funny, like, when I decided I wanted to actually say my Shahada, I was like, well, the one place I know I can find some Muslims is at Al-Aqsa. So I went there.
Okay.
Like, waited in line at the tourist gate.
Yeah.
To get in, and just sort of wandered around. I like found this office there. There's like, you know, Al-Aqsa, the Dome of the Rock, and then there's like these little offices over here.
Right.
And I just walked in and saw this guy sitting at a desk. He had a huge beard. And I was like, this is my guy.
Yeah.
So, you know, I walked in, I was like, hi, you know.
Did you know, so you spoke to him in Hebrew?
No, in English.
In English. He had a little
I didn't want to disrespect him. Like.
Okay.
Yeah, and I was like, hi, do you speak English? And he was like, yeah. It's funny, actually. I told him, I was like, so I want to become Muslim. And he just looked at me and he was like, who is she? And I was like, what?
He said that?
Yeah, he was like, who is she? The girl.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh no, there's no girl. Like, I just want to become Muslim. And he was like, you sure? Because usually like this happens that like there's a girl in the picture, like you're looking to get married. And I was like, no, I've just been reading about Islam. And so, he was great. Like, alhamdulillah, he was great. His name's Nimr. And he was like, okay, like sit down. I said my shahada with him. He called up his buddy who runs a hotel nearby. Sure. He took me over to the hotel. He told me how to make ghusl. Yep. I did that. We went back to the masjid, to Al-Aqsa.
Ghusl is the ritual purification once you become Muslim.
Yeah.
Which we also do for other cases as well.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
It's like the baptism.
The bath.
And
yeah.
I was like, oh, I get this.
Yeah.
It's like my baptism.
Yeah.
He took me back to Al-Aqsa. We prayed.
So your first prayer as a Muslim is in Aqsa?
Yeah,
Al-Aqsa.
yeah, subhanAllah.
Wow, that's crazy.
I don't think I realized at the time
like how powerful that was?
Blessed I was to do it there.
Right.
Yeah. Because I was just thinking, like, where am I going to find some Muslims? This is the one place I can be sure I will.
Okay.
It is stunningly beautiful. I was like, man, this is amazing. But like, I still didn't understand like the significance of that place. I couldn't have told you why the Dome of the Rock was there, but I could have actually. But it's you learn so much more, and you appreciate something like that later. But yeah, so I became a Muslim at the Hebrew University. It was super weird, honestly. It was I was surrounded by Jews and Christians for the most part, and
your classmates at the time, did they think it was weird, or was it like, everyone's just there to learn Hebrew? And
yeah, they definitely thought it was weird. My closest friends, like my roommates, they really stuck by me though. Okay. They really like were sort of like protective, because they knew there were people that did not like what I had done. They really were disturbed by it. So I stuck close with them. They sort of like formed this protective circle around me, which is something I'm still very grateful for to this day. But it's a weird place to be Muslim.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm forming these relationships with other Muslims. I was aware of what was going on in Palestine before, but then I started seeing it and having like all these like weird feelings about being at Hebrew University, which is actually in the West Bank. Like, it's on the other side of the Red
Is it
Line.
almost like you're there, Christians are there because they're Zionists who, in that orientation, and the Jews are there?
To some extent. Yeah, I would say there was a favorable view of Israel amongst the students there.
Sure.
By and large. And yeah, so it was a strange 6 months. It was really strange. I did it towards the beginning of my time there.
Okay.
So yeah, most of my time there, it was known that I had become Muslim, and people were very skeptical of that.
Yeah, there's what kind? Are you a mole? Are you something? All that kind of stuff, right? Government spy by some other government. Who knows what's going on? So now you come back. When did you go to Northwestern for your Ph.D.?
It was much later. So I came back, I graduated college. I spent 2 years traveling around the Middle East. I mainly lived in Cairo and Damascus.
So you learn Arabic and all that's there?
Yeah.
A little bit, okay.
Yeah. And I started applying for graduate programs for master's degrees.
What were you doing? And were you just traveling just for the sake of like traveling and exploring the Muslim world?
Well, it was like, the plan was to go to seminary after college. And then I became Muslim in my senior year. Yeah. And it was like, well, what am I going to do now? Like professionally. So I was like, I'll just take some time off to figure that out. I became an English teacher. That's what I was doing.
Okay.
To make money. And
is that lucrative, by the way, for a 22-year-old kid?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Teaching English in like the Middle East?
Yeah, you get the right job. Yeah, in Damascus, I started teaching business English. I just worked with this one company, and they had government contracts. So they basically told me to name my price, and so I did. And they kept giving me like raises every week. I had more money than I knew what to do with at that time in my life.
Really?
Yeah, I was living very well. It was great.
Is this something? So is this a viable option for people? Because like right now, going back to what we were
Not
talking
Damascus.
about. Well, not Damascus, but like Amman. I don't know what Cairo is these days, but like Morocco.
Maybe. I mean, maybe. Like I think it's kind of a different scene now.
Okay.
Like the Middle East was a very accessible place back then. From what I've heard, it's very difficult now. I mean, like it doesn't have. It's just not as open.
Okay.
As it used to be. Hey, actually, do you mind if we pause?
Sure.
For just a minute? Is that okay?
That's fine.
It's not going to mess up anything. Yeah. So.
Yeah. So I think you were talking about
teaching English.
Teaching English as a medium. Okay. So then you did that for a couple of years. Then you applied. Then you got into Northwestern.
To NYU.
NYU.
I did a master's there before Northwestern.
And what was your subject there?
It was also religious studies, history of Islam in America.
That was kind of your interest then, by that point. You kind of.
So yeah, I read a book when I was in Damascus called Blue-Eyed Devil by Michael Muhammad Knight.
Okay. He's like that punk dude, right? He's a little rogue.
He's a little rogue, yeah. He's an interesting guy. But I read a part in that book where he talked about going to Sapelo Island, Georgia, to say the Fatiha over the graves of the Muslims there. And I was like, wait, what? What? There's Muslims
That's
buried?
Pretty close to where you grew up?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's like
you talked about the beginning.
One island up from where I grew up.
Right. You mentioned that in the beginning,
like
right?
We went to Sapelo to fish growing up.
Okay.
Off the beaches there. And yeah, so it was a place that I had been many times and had no idea about this history. And it was sort of a revelation for me, like as this new Muslim who, you know, in many ways had gone to the Middle East to like try to learn more about his religion, to learn that like there had been Muslims growing up right in my backyard, you know, over a century ago, almost 2 centuries ago, but nonetheless that like that was part of my local history. That was a real trip for me to learn that. So I started reading more about it on my own, and you know became very fascinated by the history, and also realized that there wasn't that much history that had been written about it. So you know I'd always been like a pretty studious type of person. So I thought, okay, I'll go and apply to study this full time. And so that's what sort of led me down the grad school path, and got into NYU. And you know, they didn't exactly have the program for it, but there were some people there that were able to help, and it seemed very exciting to live in New York City. So
Latif was the chaplain there.
Yeah, I got to know him very well while I was there.
He was one of my first guests on this channel.
Oh, was he?
Yeah,
I love him. He's mashallah, he's a really great person. That community that he built there, really, it was my first community of Muslims, where I actually felt like I put down roots a little bit.
What year was this, by the way?
This was 2009.
Okay, because I've went to their, I don't know if they still, because I went to their center a couple years back.
Yeah.
We went to go meet Sheikh Suhaib for lunch. We missed Jummah because we just flew in, so we go there and and there's like that panoramic view of like Washington Park.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
So that's the same center then.
No, well, so when I was there, we were in the basement of a Catholic church that was a couple blocks away.
Okay.
That center was not built yet.
I got you.
And it in many ways, I have a lot of fond memories about that basement because it was sort of like it was very cozy, very like intimate community. The center now, I mean, it was becoming this while I was there, but it was sort of like it wasn't just for NYU students. Muslims from all over Manhattan would come there to pray or whatever. But I remember I actually when I graduated and I was moving out of New York, like right before I left, I helped them move the last boxes out of that basement up to where the center is now. And I've been back a couple times, and it's really nice. It's beautiful. But I missed most of that. Yeah. So we were down in that basement.
He didn't have the burger spot, did he? By then?
No, he didn't. He didn't. He had just opened, I think, an Edible Arrangements in my second year of being there.
I got you.
But So, but he, I mean, that was really like where I really started to like learn the religion, because I had like a great role model like him.
Yeah.
And a lot of other people there too.
You know, it's probably I think it's important. Sometimes when people like either convert to Islam or convert to any religion or become religious, start following the religion of their parents more seriously. Sometimes a lot of us tend to get caught up with like zealots, like a very like hardcore approach. It's almost like, well, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to go all the way, right?
Yeah.
Khalid is a guy who seems to be like pretty balanced.
Mm-hmm.
He probably wouldn't like, and he gets criticized for it. I know people are like, well, he's too soft. He's part of this like compassionate imam, which is like a whole nother. But you know,
isn't that funny?
Compassion become a pejorative.
He's too compassionate.
Right. So you finish up at NYU. Did you go to Northwestern directly from there?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, so that was 2011. Came to Chicago, so it's been almost 10 years.
Gotcha. Yeah, cool. So, what's in the future for you? You did your because most PhDs, you go into academia, right?
Yeah.
And you're did you do your master's in? You study a little bit the history of Islam in America, and then you kind of did your thesis on it. Anything specific about your thesis that people should know about?
Sure. I mean, you know, this is you get a PhD talking about their thesis. This could be another 2 hours, but so I wrote my thesis on sort of the origins of what is called the Black Muslim movement. Okay. So the Moorish Science Temple, the Nation of Islam. I was very interested in where they came from, like sort of ideologically and historically, like this claim in particular that Islam is the natural religion of the black man is just fascinating to me. You know, in part because I had become very enamored like with the history of enslaved African Muslims, and there seemed to be a connection between that and the Black Muslim movement. It's only divided by about 60 years of history.
Yep.
And many of the people who filled the ranks of the Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam in the early days were Southern migrants. So they were coming from places like Georgia and South Carolina, and you know, where we know that there had been a lot of African Muslims. So that connection sort of got me interested in it, but no one had ever talked about where these movements came from. And so that was sort of the question I was trying to answer. My answer to that question is sort of long and maybe a topic for another time.
Sure.
But I answered it in two ways. I mean, you always have to like be in conversation with the scholars who have already written something about your topic.
Yeah.
And I did not like even the questions that they asked, much less the conclusions that they came to. I found them to be sort of dead ends. But I wondered why that was. So I sort of traced the origin of like the contemporary study of African American Muslims to an FBI program that was surveilling the Nation of Islam. And the FBI had their own research division that put out published materials on groups like the NOI, the Nation of Islam, to sort of like inform their field agents about who it was that they were surveilling. And they had a profound effect on shaping the course that the academic study of these groups ended up taking. So that's sort of how I start my thesis, talking about the origins of the field that I'm engaging in. And you know, then I actually try to answer the question in a positive way. And I do that by looking at Noble Drew Ali, the founder of the Moorish Science Temple. Amazingly, no one had looked where he tells you to look. Like thinking about like the origins of these groups. He says that I am a modern day Jesus Christ, and my John the Baptist was Marcus Garvey.
Okay.
Who was the founder of a group called the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. So he points directly to Garvey. Somehow, no one had ever really looked at Garvey and his movement to see what the connection was with the Moorish Science Temple. I thought it looked like a pretty good place to start. So I did that, and what I found is that there were Muslims in the UNIA, and there were also a lot of non-Muslims who were fascinated with Islam as being sort of like this very like...
Muslims per like what we call orthodoxy within that framework.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And non-Muslims, but non-Muslims who saw Islam as sort of like this very potent like force for black nationalism.
Okay. I want to pin that thought for my last, but keep going.
Sure. And many of these people who, I'm just going to like run you through like...
Sure.
Like many of these people were influenced by an author called Edward Blyden, who was a Liberian. He was a polymath, but he wrote a book called Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race that expounds this idea precisely. Blyden, in turn, was influenced both by African Muslims that he had met on his like expeditions into the interior, and as well as Muslims living in Sierra Leone who had returned from slavery across the Atlantic. So you have sort of like this melting pot of like African Muslims who had both been in Africa and had returned from slavery in the Americas, now repatriated to Sierra Leone. And Blyden was there talking to all of them and developing these ideas about Islam being sort of like the natural religion of the black race.
Okay.
And it was his writings that really influenced the UNIA, which ended up influencing the Moore Science Temple.
Sure.
That's like the quick and dirty version of it.
Marcus Garvey, ideologically was aligned with a lot of the things you see with the Nation of Islam. Because you hear Marcus Garvey, anyone who reads about Malcolm X will come across the name Marcus Garvey.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think Malcolm X's father, I want to say, wasn't a...
He was a Garveyite, yeah.
Okay, right. So you see that connection, how that kind of like leads into one thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned like Islam is the natural religion of the black, of the black man.
Mm-hmm.
So today, we were talking before the show, and I want to wrap up with this because you, as someone of a white Anglo-Saxon background, European, you mentioned Scotland, right?
Yeah.
I've begun to engage with like other like white converts from different across either in America, Canada, the UK, etc. And they're speaking about like how they seem to they're contending with this issue of, especially in the social justice climate, almost like a pushback against whiteness by Muslims, right? And and they understand why. They understand that there's been certainly wrongs done by previous generations of their ancestors, perhaps, but at the same time, they feel like that's not within the framework of Islam. We don't believe in original sin, right? A person is not accountable for the sins of their forefathers, right? In addition, there's a sentiment that that there are many people of a European background who be very sympathetic towards Islam if it was positioned to them the right way, because they see the moral failure of the West, and they see that Islam is the only structure or ideology or whatever that can save the West in a way, right, from complete depravity. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that and many have said there's a strategy to even like do dawah to white nationalists, who might be racist for all intents and purposes, but we also know as Muslims that there is no person that we give up on, right? Just want to get your take on that approach, and like if that makes sense to you as someone who, because you yourself, they advocate, for instance, that white Muslims should marry other white Muslims. Now I understand that's not always feasible. Your wife is Pakistani. It's not always like it becomes an issue of like who's available in your city. Who do you meet? Pretty honest, because it's certainly not problematic when people say Hyderabadi Muslims should marry Hyderabadi Muslims. No one complains about that. Or Pakistani should marry Pakistanis, or Bangladeshi should marry Bangladeshis, or Arabs should marry Arabs. Yeah. But like, when people have their sentiment of like, there's a symptoms reaction that, if you're encouraging this, then all you're doing is setting up a separate white supremacist subsect within Islam where they can continue to be racist and oppressive, and just Islam will just be their religion. I said a lot there, but I just want to kind of get your take on that.
Yeah, look, I mean, we bring who we are into this religion, whether you like it or not. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think it would be fascinating if white nationalists started converting to Islam. I think there is something there. That sense of loss, of moral failure. I think there is something there that Islam speaks to very powerfully. But if white nationalists started converting to Islam, we talk very abstractly, and very ideally, like, oh, this thing shouldn't happen. Well, like, what if it does? Like, you can't stop it. Yeah. Right? All you can do is to, either like disengage, which is fine. Like, you don't have to engage with anyone that you don't want to engage in. We're all free here. Or you can try to be helpful and, maybe sort of guide them through their process of learning the religion. I would be fascinated and, extremely interested. If this ever became a thing, mm-hmm. like a phenomenon, mm-hmm. I would definitely be interested in, being on the helpful side of it. On the more wider political context in which this conversation is happening, I'll say this, one of the things that I love about, reading and researching the figures like Garvey, Noble Drew Ali, and frankly, a lot of the figures who had a profound influence on the intellectual tradition that has sort of led to where we are today with movements like Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is a very different beast from Marcus Garvey. Mm. But I think that there is some sort of continuity there. But if you go back and you read the newspaper of the UNIA, for example, I was shocked, I was surprised to see a book called The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. It was a book written by a man named Lothrop Stoddard. Okay. And he was an outward white supremacist who was worried about Islam uniting Asians and Africans into this powerful force that Europe would not be able to resist. And he was sort of writing this book how do we maintain our supremacy as a white race globally? His book was positively reviewed in the UNIA newspaper. And, not because they agreed with his book, but because he actually describes white supremacy as this project that can be dismantled, mm-hmm. right? There was an intellectual freedom at that time that I really admire. The people were not clinging to orthodoxies that limited their exposure and their engagement with the world. This is a group of people that we do not associate with. We don't engage with their thought. It's
similar to way. So let's say it's if Black Lives Matter, promoted an article by Richard Spencer. Yeah. In a way that they wouldn't necessarily agree with, but it would help them understand the mindset. Yeah. You couldn't do that. You couldn't retweet Richard Spencer without being canceled.
Yeah, or without just being associated with Richard Spencer. Right. There's a way in which we are not free to sort of explore ideas mm-hmm. today that is very new. And I mean very new. I'm not just saying this is someone with historical training. I'm saying this as someone who remembers what it was 10 years ago. Yeah. But I would just say look, you ought to engage with people that you disagree with, because they will, at the very least, if you want to consider them your enemy, you ought to know your enemy, right? What are you gaining by refusing to understand who your enemy is? Now, it may be that you discover that they might not be your enemy, or that they have maybe they have fundamentally different aims than you, but you can see this one place where you align. And that might be like the one place where you can start to build some sort of positive relationship, or at least some sort of like productive disengagement between the two of you, where there's like a mutual understanding. Where like we can come together on this one issue and nothing else.
Yep.
Right.
And we're willing to do that with certain groups, but other groups you're not. You can't even entertain the idea of it.
Yeah, and it's striking to me that like that it used to, we tend to think of the world in this progressive sense, like things are constantly getting better. I think this is an area where we've regressed. And I don't think it will last. I think it has too many failings to last forever, but I would encourage people to think critically about thinking critically.
Sure.
And to maybe at least try to understand who's sitting there on the other side of the aisle, or whatever the case may be.
Right, sounds good. If people want to reach out to you, is there a way I know you're not really on social media.
Yeah, I try to avoid it. But you can find me, where can you find me? I have a Twitter handle. I'm not on Twitter, but I see notifications.
Okay. So they can direct message you on Twitter?
They can direct message me on Twitter. It's my name without syllables, WLLCLDWLL.
Because of the character limitation?
No, because I was into Hebrew and Arabic back when I chose my, and there's no syllables in those languages for the most part. So yeah, I was just playing.
You don't have like TikTok or nothing, do you?
I don't have a TikTok. No, I think it's. I'm too old, man.
Is your thesis available for people?
If you want to read my thesis, there's an embargo on it. I am not becoming an academic, but back when I graduated, I thought I still might. And so we embargo our theses so that we can publish them as books. So that it'll be out on like ProQuest in like 10 years, I think. But if you want a copy, if anyone's interested in it, you can get in touch with me directly, and I'll send it to you. My email address is also wcaldwell@gmail.com. You can just send me an email. Old-fashioned.
All right, sounds good. Well, I think the folks appreciated it. For listeners out there, you can listen on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher. We are also on, Pocket Casts and Spotify. And then this video will be up on YouTube, and the camera is still on, so it looks like it made it. All right, for our special guest, Dr. Will Caldwell, I'm your host, Mahin the Podcaster, signing off for Sultans and Sneakers.
All right, thanks, man.